webinar series. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this very highly anticipated discussion on fatherhood and general male involvement. I am Teddy Owusu, the program coordinator, and today we will be joined by Kenneth Thompson. Before we start, note that all lines are on mute. We will have a brief session, about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A after Kenneth's presentation. But during his presentation, feel free to type in your questions in the questions box, and we will try to get to all of your questions. Kenneth Thompson works for Texas Health Department as a fatherhood specialist. He also wears many hats in the community regarding this topic, and he's also the host of The Dad Show on Wednesdays at 8 a.m. Central Standard Time on KAZI-FM. So check him out there as well. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Kenneth.
Hey, all right, let me make sure everyone can hear me. Can you hear me, Teddy?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hey.
Hello?
Hey, are you there?
Yes, everyone can hear you.
All right, everyone. Hey, good. I guess good morning, good afternoon, and to some, depending on where you are in the country. As Teddy said, my name is Kenneth Thompson. I am the Fatherhood Program Specialist for the Department of Family Protective Services in the state of Texas. And in fact, this position that I have is one of few in the welfare system, but I think also you're starting to see more welfare systems across the nation employing fathers, at least the fatherhood specialists in those arenas, because we understand that the value of fathers sometimes have been understated, and when we recognize collectively that children will always look for their fathers, and that blood is thicker than water, and so we'll put something short here together for you to hopefully to stimulate some dialogue about a father's value and where their father comes from and what makes him up. So today's topic is knowing your value. And let me preface this by saying that I was a father at 19 years old, and I grew up without a father, and I grew up in a part of our community where many of my friends also had fathers, did not have fathers rather. And what was really interesting is that when we look back, we look at those who did have fathers and look how their lives have kind of changed versus those of us who did not have fathers in many capacities. So again, welcome to the show. And what we'll talk about also is the collective engagement of fatherhood through peer education. And I know I may be talking to young folks here and younger folks here, but when I think about peer education, what I'm talking about is that, hey, how do we talk to one another? What information sources or resources are we for each other? And can we be better resources for each other? And should we be resources for one another? And so when you start hearing the collective engagement about fatherhood, and really we want to talk about is, hey, how well are we doing within ourselves as individuals? Are elevating the role of fathers? Are we devaluing the role of fathers? And then also I would ask us to take a look at our families also, and see how that role of fathers have impacted your family collectively, has it in fact impacted your family generationally also. And then if you are a father, a young father, then we have some things specifically that I want to say to you as talking to you about your value. And so we will continue the conversation. But what I really hope that you learn here through this presentation is to connect this audience with the value of peer-to-peer education. Some things that I think that we do all the time, but I think perhaps we don't always recognize what we're doing. And so part of this conversation here that we want to have today when we talk about the peer-to-peer education is also recognizing when that's happening. And then once it recognizes it's happening, embrace it in some capacities and either take it in and make sure that, and then it validate it or not accept it. And then also, if you don't accept it, but the premise of the conversation, and then offer a solution or ideas how to keep the community or keep your audience engaged also. And then we'll reflect on some things that this chapter that has changed within our lifetimes, and all of us, and that is the difference between communities versus neighborhood, and the impact, and that impact on resources. And I want you to start thinking about all the events that take place that you are accustomed to or you hear about, and I want you to start asking yourself, right? Are these things happening in the community? Are they happening in neighborhoods? And are they the same? And then I hope to provide you some insight, good folks, on the value of a father. And I just tell you that I think that over time, the pendulum is swinging back. At one time, in particular, families of color. Historically, we have always had fathers in our houses, but over the last 40 years, some of those things have changed. And then they have also changed with that first statement I talked about with neighborhoods and communities also. And so we'll talk about the insight of the value of a father, and surely also get your insight and your opinion on what you think of a father and and his legacy, and what does he have to offer, and do you view him the same as perhaps as we looked at fathers many years ago. Now, when I first started thinking about fathers, and I kind of look into my life also as a father, as a young father, the question I asked, are we in a crisis? Right? I mean, around fatherhood. And when you think about the word crisis, you think about this thing called the instability or danger in a social, economic, political, and even in international affairs that changes how people look at different circumstances. So let's think about this thing called fathers and the absence of fathers, right? Let's think about some of these things when you think about the crisis, right? Think about wherever you're at. Look at your dropout rate and look at that rate to those who have fathers engaged in their life versus those who do not. Take a look at early teenage pregnancy and look there also and see those who, and I am not saying that when a father is in your life that these things does not happen. What I am saying, though, when fathers are in their kids' life, they don't happen nearly as much to others. When you look at the high rate of incarceration, and when you look at sexually transmitted diseases, when you look at destructive relationships, and highly dysfunctional families, and then another thing you look at also around this crisis, good folks, is talk about infant mortality, right? And so what I think what this crisis tells us, indirectly and directly, is that fathers have value. And that value is like a ripple effect. And when that father is not healthy and healthily engaged in his family or in his community, these are the things that we tend to deal with. And we think about this condition of instability. I want to, I don't know how many of you can go back a couple of years ago when this young man was trying to go home. He was living in Chicago, Illinois, and he was trying to make it home. And there was a few young folks who wanted him to be part of a gang, and he had chosen not to be part of that gang. But yet, this young man was beat to death. He was an A student, had higher aspirations in his life, and he had both parents. But yet, this kid was beat to death because he didn't want to be a part of a gang, and I'll talk about that a little bit further in the presentation. And what you found is that when they started interviewing all the 11 kids who had beat this young man to death, one thing that was consistent in all of their lives is that their fathers weren't in their lives. And many times their fathers have already been in incarceration. So when you look at this thing called instability, and I want you not to just look at it from today, but I want you to look at it, hey, where was it? And where is it headed also? When you think about instability, look at your family and look at those who that you invest time with, and take a look at those folks also, and look at their situation and see. I mean, look at even on the international level. Look at societies where, hey, you're starting to see the absence of fathers, and I think you're starting to see the instability in those places also. Now, this thing called peer education. Peer education is an approach to health, is an approach to health promotion. And really what it talks about is those of us who live in communities and neighborhoods where we enhance the change of the dynamics of our community. And then also by talking and relating to one another and talking to, not so much talking at one another. Right? Peer education is teaching or sharing health information, values, and behaviors. Right? And others, educating others who may share similar social backgrounds in life. And that's what we're talking about here. Right? Many times we say things to one another in passing, but do we really value the conversation that we're having? And so we'll talk about, but that's the value of something. Some things have, what has left us also collectively is the value in the peer-to-peer conversation, the brother-to-brother conversation, the sister-to-sister conversation, right? The brother-to-sister conversation around matters, about issues that matters to the sustainability of who we are as a nation, and as a people as well. And so you're here when I've got a chance to talk to my peers about the work that I do. It's some of it, a lot of it's academic, but a lot of it also is what we have lived, and you know, and then also what is evaluating our families and taking a great look, a good look at our families and looking at those families and see, hey, what can we share in that concept also to build them up within our families, so therefore when they leave the house, they go out and have a healthier conversation with other people also. And so what we can do in part of this peer conversation, believe it or not, at a peer level, sometimes you have more impact at a peer level than parents do, and our parents do rather. And so you will understand that your voice has a significant amount of value. Now here, what's really very interesting here, when you think about the United States of America, you know what? 97% of us believe that fathers are just as important as mothers in the development of children. Now, that sounds interesting. That's pretty good, and I think it's good reason for that. But what really is interesting about that dynamic, though, you know, is that when we look at the structure of our families today, you know, when we take a look at our structures of families today, some things about this don't always add up. You know, and I don't know what happened to the other 3%. Maybe they've had horrible relationships with their father, but I don't know how they got here without it. But we do believe that fathers are just as important. And I think when you think about how we have gotten here collectively as people, it takes two seeds. It takes two seeds to begin this whole thing that's called life. And so, yes, and no matter who you are and what you are, if you're trying to create life, you're going to need some elements that only a man or a father can provide. Now, the one that's kind of disturbing down here also is one of these facts that I think we should take a hard look at, and that is when we talk about the United States of America. We lead the world in fatherless homes. And I want us to think about that. And this is what I like for all of those who are in the listening audience to do. I want you to just take a moment and in your mind, look at your family from the left to the right to the front to the center. And then look at all the folks that you have come in contact with. And I would almost bet you that there's not too many folks listening to my voice today you know, that you don't know someone, that you do not know someone who's grown up without their father. In fact, there's probably a few of you here that's listening today based on the statistics that says that you have grown up without your father. And so when you think about the United States of America, and we leave this world and this fatherless family, and think about that. And I think give you some time. Think about that. Think about where you come from and where you live and your attitudes. And think about, you know, what have you seen disappear from your community, or what have you never seen in some of your neighborhoods. And I think when you start to think about that question that I asked, when you go through your mind, and I can guarantee you most of us can identify with someone who's grown up without their father in their lives, right? And there's also some other sad statistics about that, you know, as I was talking about earlier, the teenage pregnancy, the dropout rate. And I think when we go back and look at the numbers and look at the activity over the years, we see the impact of fathers or the absence of fathers in our children's life, in many of our children's life. And so we have to get better at that. We will not as a nation live to lead anything if this becomes the norm for the United States of America. But as I said, I think the reason why we're having these conversations today, I think the pendulum is swinging back, because I think what we have recognized collectively over time is the value of that father, and particularly, good folks, the value of poor fathers. All right, that's what I am enjoying, the value of our poor fathers. We're coming back to understand it's not about money, it's about time, and then also make sure we reconstitute his value, understand that he has value, and he can change the dynamics and the trajectory of how his kids look at the world. Now, one of the things that you have to always understand about us is, hey, our psychological framework, right? And where do we get these things from? Our beliefs and our values. Where do those core principles start at? And I want you to pay close attention to that. Where do they start at? Where do they start at? Because later on in the presentation, you're going to hear me talk about this word deficit, right? But also, what gives me purpose in life as a father? And particularly based on what neighborhood and what community I come from, who has been there for me that said I have value. When I'm looking at this thing called this media and coming through this tube and the music that I hear, what is it saying about me in terms of my purpose, and what is it doing for me in terms of my thought process? What I think about who I am, what I think about my future, what do I think about my relationship with my kids, what do I think about my relationship with my community? And then you think about this when you think about this thing called emotions. Now, I will testify in front of everyone that says, you know, men, what we have this thing called pride that gets all in our way. And in fact, one of the presentations I was telling someone the other day, this word called emotion, and I didn't even know those things existed, right, until I had a girlfriend. I mean, I just didn't until she told me one day in her life that her feelings was hurt. And I'm looking at her like, what is a feeling? You know, and because what I've been programmed in some of the environments that I grew up in is that you don't deal with emotion. And so where did that come from? That's part of my psychological makeup. Who comes in and redirects me? And then we think about my behaviors and my actions. How do I behave and how do I react to certain situations, certain environments? And what I want you to be able to understand is that those things start at the beginning. Those things start at the beginning of life. Many of those things start most of these things start in the womb of a woman's stomach. And so therefore, all the things about attitudes and how we look at the world can impact me. And then when I come out of that womb, you know, who's there for me to reinforce my values and my beliefs and my purpose and how I act and how I deal with emotions? Who's there for me? And we take a look at the next slide, and it really tells you no one, right? If you take a look at this here, you know, when you think about the African American community, if 72% of us is now growing up in single parent households, right? Now, and I am not saying that a single parent, and surely a single parent and a mother cannot raise a healthy child. I am not saying that at all. I was raised by a single parent, and also I was raised in a neighborhood, and also I was raised in a time when the environments were different. I tell folks all the time that my mother was a cross between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. If the left didn't get you, the right would. But also in today's environment, my mom would probably be doing time being incarcerated using those same tactics that she used. Giving me birth. And so also that goes back. That statement goes back to how some things have shifted in our society also about who's really responsible and how much can you be responsible in terms of providing direction for your kid. But if we are at the 72% in terms of coming into this arena with this single parent, and then again, go back to the slide that I just talked about, who's putting information in me? Where is that coming from? My beliefs, my values, my thoughts. Where are those things being formulated at? Now think about someone who's healthy, all right, who's coming to the world at the same time, and perhaps have two sources of inputs going into them, versus this person who has one, and depending on what environment that I'm being raised in, what else are other things that I'm seeing that may have a serious impact on my beliefs, my values, how I view my life with a purpose, what do I think about, how do I process thoughts about you, about myself, about relationships, how do I deal with emotions? And I think also you start to see this number arise within the Hispanic community also. Now also I will say this, good folks, one of the things that we have to also be mindful of is this, is that the family dynamics continue to change also. The family dynamics continue to change. So they may lead to some of this high percentage. But again, I would ask you to go back and look into your family, look into your life, and see how many folks that you know have been born or been raised recently, within the last 5 years, by a single parent household. Now, the question I have for you that we start talking about is, who are you? When I'm talking to other fathers, not only just from Texas, but from around the country, I want to know, who you are, and then I ask this question: are you from a neighborhood? Are you from a community, right? And then ask yourselves, are they the same, right? Are they the same? When you think about those things, are they the same? And does when you think about resources, does the folks who have to provide you the resources or that you need, do they have any biases depending on, are you from a neighborhood, or are you from a community, right? And so when I asked you, when I asked that question, I asked that question for a couple of reasons. As we have integrated, some things have changed. I like to tell folks that I grew up in a neighborhood. But also I've been through integration where I've moved also. But the difference, I would say, that was in my neighborhood. I used to think that every man in my neighborhood, listen to me, had the right to be. I thought they always going to be pastors, preachers, because every man in your neighborhood back in the day had the right to lay their hands on you and redirect you. Now the question I ask you, is that the same in communities today? Is that the same in communities? Right? And I would almost say that those are not. I would say that those are all not. In fact, I think you go back to some of the slides we talked about where we're actually afraid of young men in our communities many times today. And so that's the question I want you to really to think about. Now, in both of these things, what services are provided in the community versus the neighborhood? Are the services that, do you have the same in your communities? Do you have transportation versus the kind of transportation you may have in your neighborhood? Do you have access to medical care in your neighborhoods like the same access that you may have in communities, right? Who sets the moral compass? As I was telling you earlier, when I lived in the neighborhood, and without that father also, we still had men in that neighborhood that would help set the moral compass. I mean, if someone was not doing what their mama told them to do, then you had other folks that would redirect you and make sure that you got more engaged in that process. Now the question is, does that happen in communities? Does that happen in communities? Or do we see more law enforcement in communities today playing some of the same roles collectively that sometimes surrogate men play back in our neighborhood, right? Is there stated expectations in your neighborhood? In the neighborhoods, are there stated expectations? What do you need to do to get out? Are you trying to get out of the neighborhood? Or are you trying to get into the neighborhood? And think about that mentality when you're thinking about you as a young man and you are trying to make your way through things, through life, you start asking yourself, is this a place for me? Or am I stuck in this place, right? Again, what are the resources in that? What are the resources, you know, that neighborhood has that perhaps can help elevate that young person, that young father, right, to see their value, to see their purpose. Now, is that different when you go outside of the neighborhood and go into different communities? And then does those places in the communities provide a place where one feels safe and secure about going to those places? Are those places mandated? All right. And within your neighborhood, have your faith institutions, have they changed, or are they still the same, right? And then also you start looking at the neighborhoods in your community. Hey, what are the family connections? In your neighborhoods, you know what, more likely in neighborhoods, you have a lot of individuals from the same families that may be, you know, in close proximity. Now, that changes when I start moving out to the suburban areas and different parts of the community, right? And so that's just one thing that I want you to take a look at. Take a look at where you're from. What's making you up, right? What are the resources there that can help you be a better person, that provides you with hope, that provides you with opportunity? Do those things reside today in your neighborhood, or are they in your community? And one of the things, and we think about the impact of this peer-to-peer education, I think about when I look at communities, right? You know, now one thing communities can do, and some of these things are consistent with one another, neighborhood and community, but in your communities, there's an opportunity to break down barriers, because and the reason why I say that is because you're probably in a much more integrated environment when you're living in a neighborhood versus some neighborhoods, right? And also, there can be a sense of unity in some communities. You know, communities have names and things of that nature, and more likely have places for you to congregate to actually develop a common core. It helps you develop a language that I think is consistent with within a community. And if there are healthier opportunities there, if there's more employment there, then also I think it also improves our birth outcomes also. Then it also provides formal places for you to have conversations to make sure you're connecting with this thing called peer-to-peer education. And then also it has the capacity to also to increase awareness. Now, when I think about the neighborhoods, right, one thing about a neighborhood that I think about it is that it also helps restore us hope, because sometimes when you've been impacted by a neighborhood, if you're still there and you are the shining beacon, or you are the father of several young people in the neighborhood, and other folks seeing you do it, then you can provide some level of hope that for others can be there also. And then also by doing that, in some neighborhoods where neighborhoods have been beaten down, if you have someone in that neighborhood that feels good and that is active, right, it also can build a some self-worth, a sense of worthiness within that neighborhood also, right? And then also the thing about neighborhoods also, it will always connect you to some history about those neighborhoods also, right? And then the neighborhoods can also be one of those conduits that can reduce the barriers through conversation. And what I simply mean by that is that when you're in a neighborhood and you're walking and you're talking, perhaps also you start to see that there's more commonality there also with the neighborhoods, and so therefore maybe you start to forge a pact together because of the commonalities, and perhaps you're moving in the same directions also. And then also it provides this informal networking, you know, and what I try to tell my colleagues all the time, that in poor neighborhoods or in neighborhoods, usually there's a language in that neighborhood that exists where folks do a very good job of taking care of themselves. And in fact, in poor neighborhoods, what poor people often understand clearly is that they are poor, and perhaps they have made some have made mistakes in their life, but provided with the right types of incentives, with hope, perhaps also they can also move beyond that while also moving their children to a better world, a better place also. And when I think about the oneness in the zip code, you know, what has changed also about our society is that, You know, we don't look at, you know, at one time neighborhoods and communities used to have names. Now when you're looking at services and you're looking at this thing called disproportionality and all of those kind of things, you start really identifying folks by their zip code. And then also, I want you to also think about this word called gentrification, right? And what has happened to some neighborhoods. I know some of the neighborhoods that I've seen that's been gentrified. Those neighborhoods now look like communities when I look at what services are readily provided in those communities now. For instance, I think in some of our neighborhoods, when we look at having police come to and you know the time it takes for them to respond to a call, but as the neighborhood has been gentrified, I noticed from based on some of the national data that I've looked at, those calls tend to go down a lot quicker. So, hey, again, where are you from? What impacts you? Who makes you? What makes you who? Now, I cannot go through any kind of conversation when I'm talking about fathers and talking about young people without talking about domestic violence. And it has very little to do with Ray Rice and all the things you're seeing on the national level. Now, which has been good in some ways because I think what it has done has brought some of this stuff to light. You know, some of these things that's been hidden, that happens in a lot of our families, and it happens in our families whether we're in neighborhoods or communities. But let me say this about domestic violence, right? It's a very serious matter. It can be a very deadly matter. And if you're in these situations, you want to handle these things with the utmost concern and delicacy. And then also you want to try to make sure that the individual that may be the victim, right, is getting help, right, and so make sure. And then again, you go back to this thing where I talked about. Are the resources in your neighborhood or in their communities for this domestic violence, right? And also, one of the things that we say about domestic violence is that, hey, no longer can we let the perpetrator off the hook, right? We have to hold that person accountable also, and most times that is a male, and we have to hold him accountable because this is a learned activity. And surely if you learn it, you can unlearn it. And if you understand there's some consequences to it, and then perhaps it'll make you want to unlearn it better, right? But this domestic violence is all about control. In fact, I think it's about insecurity on the perpetrator's part, right? But also, I just want to say this about a perpetrator don't come in colors. I mean, they can be any color. They can be from any age group. They can be from any economic group also. So make sure you take your blinders off there, right? But you want to make sure that if you have someone that is dealing with domestic violence, make sure that they get the right services. That's critical. Now, sharing knowledge, a part of this thing, you know, when you think about peer education, you know, hey, part of this thing, when you're in a classroom, when you come out of the classroom, you're having a conversation with each other. And sometimes what you want to do is make sure you pick up on those things because sometimes we learn a little different things because the way we learn is different. We pick up different things. So therefore, you want to make sure in your classroom environment that you have a pretty diverse group of people that you're hearing from also, and particularly when you're talking about things around parenting, around being a father, so therefore you perhaps get different perspectives of what others go through also, right? And then also there's classes that you can always take, parenting classes, and sure, you can hang out with us on webinars to get more information also, and sure, there's plenty printed and research materials about anything that you want to know. And surely you want to get as much information about parenting and being a father as much as possible. And then we think about the informal process, right? You got, hey, my brother's keepers. And I use that term, and I know the president has started using that term also, and it's nothing new. But my brother, it's brother to brother. Every once in a while, can no one help someone other than someone who can identify with it. Now, I'm not saying that a white person can't help a black person can't help a white person. I'm not saying it at all. What I'm saying is that sometimes there's some things that you go through, and there's some periods in your life, the things that you're dealing with, that sometimes the only person that can help you sometimes is someone who looks like you because they can identify with you. But also, when I say this, and I say this also, but that's why I think also you want to always expand who you are as an individual and try to make sure you have good people around you. And it's also sister to sister. And sometimes I would say that we have to also make sure we're listening to our female counterparts because they can also provide some insight to how we think that we are projecting ourselves. And sometimes it is the female who can provide more clarity to that than other males. And remember this: if you have a friend and all your friend is doing is telling you all the things that you're doing are right, then you may want to check that, because your friend who's going or your brother who's going to tell you the things that you need to know, not just the things that you should know. And then also, hey, this knowledge sharing, it's a natural thing, man. I mean, it's one of these things that we've done through time, and I think we have to be mindful of the technology that's slowly infiltrating our lives, that's taking some of these things away. You know what I mean? There was a time when all I had to do was say, "What's up, brother?" You can understand what I was talking about. How you doing? A nod shake. But now the technology sometimes may be taking some of those things away. So knowledge sharing has always been a natural thing. And I think that also within the men in the male capacity, we need to make sure we embrace those things, because we don't always go and get the formal education. So therefore, we have to be better at the informal information that we're communicating to one another about our value, about our connection, and how to stay engaged with our children, our families, and our communities. Now, when I think about men, one of the things that I think about, and I want to know, do we really understand our value? Do we really understand our value? And I want you to go back to what I was talking about very early when I said, hey, who helps me define who I am? Who gives me my beliefs and my values? Where did that come from, right? And so if I don't have a father there in my life, then some of these things I struggle with. And I want you to listen to this term here, and I maybe expand upon it a little more. And Ted, if I don't, ask me about it at the end of this. Many times, depending on where you're coming from, what neighborhood or what community you're coming from, you may be operating with a deficit, right? And if you're operating with a deficit, then that just tells you that you have other. That just tells you that you're starting off. That person is starting off at a negative, right? And so, do he really understand? Does he really comprehend his value? I mean, does he understand that regardless of whether he's making money or not, that, you know what, that part of his arena is making sure his kid is safe, you know, and his kid has well-being. And like I said, that doesn't mean that you have to be in some exclusive neighborhood. You can do those kind of things in a poor neighborhood. Who puts my self-appreciation, my self-worth in me also? When a father understands that that's part of his role and he can add that to his children, then perhaps he start looking at himself a little different. Who teaches my kid about self-respect? You know, and how to build character, the building of character. You know, the value of my community. Hey, what is this going? As this dad, do we ask these dads, what are they going to do their legacy? And talk to me about ownership and trust, right? And how I respond to life challenges, life challenges. You know, death. You know, and you know, certain things that happen on a regular basis. Who tells me about how to deal with those things? And if I don't have that dad there, someone who gives me that, provides that shoulder for me, then what happens? Then what happens to me? I wonder. And then I sometimes I follow this thing called peer pressure. We're talking about peer-to-peer conversations here now, but when we think about this peer pressure, one of the things that dads should do, and particularly dads, I think, poor fathers, that they can do is provide their kids cover to do much better in school than they do today. And what I simply mean by that is that when you talk to your kid, when this father is telling that kid that their job is to go to school and get an education and not to worry about those folks who are trying to get them to be gang members or things of that nature, and that that father is present, then I think also the kids would also, who are working, who's dealing with his children, would recognize that this father is serious about his business, and he understands his value. And then the question I ask a lot of folks also, when you take a look at this, is, hey, what track are you on? And if you stay on the track that you're on right now in terms of how you deal with yourself, how you deal with your community, if you're a father, how you're dealing with your family, you know, what is going to be your likely outcome? What is going to be your likely outcome? What would be your, if you're still on that track? Or do you need to switch tracks? It's not that you don't have this locomotive running inside your head, but the question I would ask my fathers is, hey, what is your value as it relates to your children? And perhaps that would cause me to burn some dendroids and maybe switch tracks on how I deal with my kid, how I process information, where I show up, and where I go. And then also my attitude toward life, and how do I make sure that I'm passing on the right attitude to my children. And here, what I would say to my fathers is, hey, don't surrender your options. All right? Now, if you're not a father, don't become one until you're ready. And don't blame her. Don't say that she needs to be on a pill. She needs to be on some of those. This is, hey, if you are not a father, then you don't surrender your options. Don't depend on someone else to help plan out your future in this manner. There's enough information out there about safe sex, what you need to do, and how you do it, right, to where you can't be blaming someone else if someone else come up pregnant. That's on you as a father. So don't surrender your options and give it to someone else. And then here's just some other father facts. There's 67.7 million fathers across America, 25.8 fathers who was a part of a marriage family. And then this one here, the 24 million, 34% children who live with their actual fathers, which is a good thing. Because also, we also recognize that once fathers are sometimes separated from their families, their children never show up at their house. I think it says somewhere maybe almost 20% of all children whose fathers, who live away from their fathers, never step in the house. Now, I also would say this, that says a lot about the father, and it also says a lot about the woman that he's living with also. And then I would say this to my ladies when I say that. Also, I would say this to the ladies who may be here, as you're doing the peer-to-peer conversation. Hey, there's only one group of women that I know that has this word "strong" associated with their name, and that's women of color. And I would just say to women of color, hey, that works well if that's strong. If that strong is a presence, but if it's an attitude, then that's going to create more issues also. But also, you want to negotiate your landscape. You want to be conscientious of who you are as a person, as a being. Who are you? You know, what is your image? You know, because image matters. And anytime you hear someone says, I don't care what somebody else is think, you know what, they're absolutely lying to you, in my opinion. I mean, because I think we all care about what they think. And when you have someone say something like that, that's a good time when you ask the question to someone, how did you get that way? You know, and then think about the impact that you have on others, and then also the impact that others have on you. Are those negative impacts or those positive things that you walk away from, right? And then start thinking about, hey, what's the outcomes that you want for yourself as a father, as a prospective father? What do you want? Look at the life that you have lived and look at the other people around you and ask yourself, what do you want different? Or can you do something different? Can you be something different? And I'm one who believes that you can. And then just talk about some of the strategies when you're engaging me. Hey, you know what? It's always nice to reflect on my past, you know, to some degree. And that's part of the peer-to-peer conversation, man. Hey, man, my dad wasn't in my life either. Well, mine was. How did it work out for you? Well, mine wasn't, and so these are some of the struggles I've had, you know. And as a professional, you know, we'll talk about these things because these things may impact how I deal with everyday situations, how I deal with my family, what relationships I have also, right? Inquire about my family dynamics, right? Who really raised me? I mean, sometimes I hear folks who've been raised by their grandparents, someone who's been raised by foster parents, right? What is my relationship with my own father, stepfather, my mother's boyfriend? Sometimes I may not like being a man because what I've had to go through to get to this process. And remember this, every young person, every young man, every young boy, rather, wants to be part of a gang. And that gang initially is a gang called manhood, but if no one is there to give him the proper ways to enter to that gang, then he will find out different ways how to enter to this gang, and that gang sometimes then become unproductive. It becomes unproductive, right? And then ask these folks also, as a father, you know, what would you like for your child's life to be like? You know, the same as yours or different? And if he says different, then you start talking about what are some of the things you think you can do that can make your son's life different or your child's life different than your life, right? And then ask the question that someone, I wish someone would ask me, is that what kind of father do I want to be? I mean, every once in a while, just talk to these guys, and when you have these peer-to-peer conversations, then talk about the father you want to be. You know what I mean? Are there images on television of men that you'd like to be your father? And or if not, if you had a real good father, and you want to share that and you want to be like him, you know, and the thing about it, if your father wasn't good for you, then perhaps you want to be a little different than he was. Now, just some of the barriers as we start to run down on time that impacts a father's participation. One thing is that impacts a lot of fathers' participation is that when I talked about earlier, don't surrender. Sometimes we surrender. Sometimes we give up before we even get started. And that's because historically we have not always been a group of men who run to systems. We don't run to systems. So sometimes we give up, and sometimes it's just the systemic issues of working with another system sometimes cause men to run away, because sometimes we don't really have the time or the understanding how to navigate those systems, and we think some of those systems are already set up against us. But some things, if someone has a pregnant, someone is expecting children, you know, some of the things that impacts him, right? First of all, does he claim the kid? But also, if you go back to this thing, if he's unemployed, also, and look at these numbers in some of our communities where the employment rates are absolutely sky high, and look at some of the things that are associated with those things also. Relationship status, right? Those things, unemployment impacts those things, right? Flexibility, where can I go, when can I go there? Transportation, I mean, that means I have to more likely catch public transportation, right? Do I feel good about who I am as a man? And so that also helps fuel this thing when I'm sitting around and not being able to get a job, and perhaps I got this one mark on me because I've been incarcerated. Does that lead to this thing called domestic and family violence? And what I like to say to dads is that it doesn't have to. It shouldn't have to. There's different options that we can use in terms of our frustration about systems, and we should never revert to domestic and family violence, because, again, the family violence that we're seeing can end up being generational. And there's some other things that impacts the barriers of men's health. Hey, our mental health, that impacts how we get our mental health. The lack of confidence, right? Again, the alienation from our support system. Maybe we have been so horrible for so long that our families don't want to have anything to do with it. And surely if our families don't have anything to do with it, then maybe the girl's family don't want to have to do anything with it. Then we got this thing called drug abuse and incarceration that sometimes run rampant in some of these communities. So now, the recruitment tool, when I say, hey, talk about it, happens, it's natural. It happens every day, but when it happens on a daily basis, what I want you to become more conscientious of when it's happening and take it in. And then as the next word said, hey, it should be purposeful. And what I'm saying is it should have some meaning for it. And it also should have an impact on who you're talking to as you're talking to your friends, because this is about life. And it's not just about a moment in life. It's about the generational impacts that conversation can have also. And believe it or not, right, it's associated with the power of doing what's right by yourself and by your brother or your sister. and it's long lasting. I think you hear and you retain more things that you learn in an informal setting that has value to you than you do in a formal setting. And then also just remember this thing called disproportionality, where you have an overrepresentation of children in these systems, whether these children be in your special ed system, whether they be in your welfare system, whether they be in your judicial system. And you can go back and look at all of these systems, good folks, and you can see the absence of fathers in most of these systems. So we're saying as fathers get more engaged, then some of our societal problems will go away also. And here, just to remember, some of the outcomes when fathers are engaged in their children's life, right? School-age children, they are better academic achievers. You know what? They do better on their standardized tests. They work better with the judicial system. They work better in terms of how navigating and working with other people in particular certain situations, because when fathers have been with their kids, you've given them some other things perhaps that they need to learn how to survive. You know, they are less likely to be a teenage pregnancy, and they're more likely to view a father as a role model. All right. And then finally, all right, and as you're talking to these dads in this peer-to-peer conversation, you know, hey, introduce a new vocabulary to them. Introduce this thing about legacy. You know, because let me say this to you, as a father, as an individual, you leave a legacy whether you choose to or not. Talk to them about invest. Invest. I mean, there's the invest in this child. As I said earlier, because so many of them operate at a deficit because no one has been invested in them also. And talk about who's going to be the architect of breaking these cycles. If the father has had a record of incarceration or anything of that nature, right, or not dropped out of school, then talk about empowering him, right, about breaking cycles, and that he has that ability to, for his family to change the dynamics about his family. And then finally, hey, create a family model. You know, I mean, something that he and his family create that's uniquely theirs. I have one for my family, and I didn't have, as I said, my father didn't give one, and the one that my son and I have, and my son and my entire family, it simply says, never surrender and always keep the faith. But we play off that never surrender that you can't do anything, never surrender that you weren't born with a purpose, never surrender that if you do what's right, good things will happen, and then always keep the faith that, you know what, if you take care of your business, hey, things tend to happen. Good for you. And so what I'm saying to you, these are some of the things that many fathers, particularly poor fathers, don't get an opportunity to do. And then here, just talked about, you know, when he really gets in his children's life, that he has the capacity to change the trajectory of how his kids look at the world. Now, now we're going to Q&A, and as I close, I'll just say, when I look at that last slide, and the reason why I put that slide up, you're talking to a guy that is was a product of the welfare system, but also you're talking to a guy whose son had flown on Air Force One. And so I want to thank you for spending some time with me, and Ted, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Kenneth, for that presentation. Excuse me. So we have a couple of questions that are coming up, but before we get to that, I wanted to cover a few things with you, Kenneth. For one, President Obama launched the My Brother's Keeper initiative to address the persistent gaps in opportunity faced by young boys and young men of color. Can you just briefly go over how fatherlessness contributes to these gaps, and furthermore, how do programs such as My Brother's Keeper substitute for absent fathers, and do those programs, these type of mentoring programs, peer education programs, do they actually make up for those gaps, those issues?
Well, let me answer the first one, the last one first. I don't know if they make up for the absence of fathers, but as I said earlier, Ted, if you remember, when I talked about the neighborhood and we had the surrogate fathers versus the community where they're not there, you know, you have more informal programs. And what I do think about the Brothers Keepers will be able to do is provide venues and for more men to be visible for more young men in our community, and start having what I call table conversations about the real life issues that they deal with. And so I think that it can be a component of helping young men and replacing that fatherlessness. but nothing other than a father really can be that father for him. But I do think that my brother's keeper, what it's also doing, I think also, Teddy, it is raising the conscious interest level. Many of the men, particularly black men in communities, about what we need to do and what we need to be more engaged in also. And really, rather than walking around with our eyes open and not seeing anything, really becoming more engaged in the problem, be part of the solution of the problem of fatherlessness. And doing that, Teddy, through the peer-to-peer conversation and talking to other men who are not in their kids' life about that's their job. And I think at times we ran away from that.
Okay, great. So our first question, and you touched on this a little bit, but please go into further detail. What should be the extent of male involvement in their partner's health, women's health, for example?
I think it should be, I think if a man is smart, and which I think most of us can be, we will be involved from when she says she's pregnant, we get involved from there. Because what we find out is that just think about this, men. When her body's going to have this new seed growing into it, when we are there, we take the stress away from her, right? She don't have to worry about where I'm at. So when she knows, when I'm engaged and I'm healthy and engaged, so I'm a father before the kid comes into the world. When I'm doing the belly rub, when I tell her, listen, what time is the doctor's appointment? See, when I'm on top of it as the father, as the male, then she's going to be on top of it. In fact, statistics will tell us is that when fathers are more involved in their kids' life at preconception, kids are born much more healthier and have a better possibility of thriving in the world. And that's really irregardless of your income, has nothing to do with income or race or ethnicity.
Okay. So the next question we have, so since you went over lack of self-worth and not knowing your value and how that impacts a young man, we have a question here. How can a peer educator, once they recognize that someone has a lack of self-worth, how should they approach such a person as their peer?
Well, I think what I would do, and I just go back to how I would approach it. I would approach the person, maybe, get them out into a place where perhaps they're comfortable, and just in a very informal way, right? I would ask them, what is your value? What do you think your worth is? And then I think what we also have to do is that when we ask those questions, we have to let folks think about it also. Sometimes we ask questions we already have the answers. But then also let them struggle. But then also when it's time for us to provide input, have some facts about what their worth is. And then also if there's something that we have seen them do in life, that they've participated in life, right? Reinforce some of those good things, like, hey, I see you when you volunteered here, what, that was a good thing. So I think what you want to do is identify positive moments in their life, but then also recognize that, that it's okay to feel bad, but not staying there. You can't stay there. So, it's not saying, hey, I feel bad also, but I can't stay in this position because, again, go back to that one thing, the one slide about the track, and I would just ask, well, if you stay on this track for the rest of your life, what do you think your outcomes are? And I think sometimes you have to make us start to think about that and process that information on our own.
Okay. Our next question, Mr. Thompson, I am a young father, former gang member, and formerly incarcerated. I'm sorry that somebody else asked the question and it threw me off. Okay. So I'm looking to help rebuild my community. I'm involved in many community initiatives, but how do I impact change on a national level?
Well, this is what I would say to the. First of all, I would say kudos to you, and I like the fact that I'm proud of him. The fact that you've had all those experiences and you're coming out and you still want to do something collectively. So what I would say, I'm going to quote what one of my friends who gave me a quote from a South African young man who was 10 years old who died of AIDS, and it simply says to you, my brother, is that do what you can in the place that you are, in the time that you have, right? And if you do it there, then perhaps, you know what, it will have some ripple effects to where it will then move from your city or your neighborhood or community to your city, to your county, to your state, and then perhaps on a national level. But I think initially, do things where you are, kind of document those things, and then also try to partner up with other like organizations within your neighborhood or community. But also, young man, know this, that every one of the folks who do like work are not always open to having other folks there. And so just be mindful of that and just understand how to navigate situations. But I would say do the work that's in where you are. Do it so well to where other folks will start to seek you out. And make sure you start documenting outcomes for those folks who you're working with also.
Thanks. Let's see. Okay, our next question. It seems as if there has been a nationwide systematic attack on fathers of color since the Civil Rights Act. Do you believe that, and how can we help non-resident fathers of color believe that the system really does believe in their future when another part of the system, the criminal justice system, he has in parentheses, seems to be against them?
Well, this is what I think I would educate the folks to say, look, when we think about the history of our country, a country that I love, but very seldom there's any system that's been created for men of color. I mean, not to be positive. I mean, they've just not been created. And so what I would go back and talk to this young person about, yes, there's some truth to what he said, because at one time the welfare system, you couldn't get benefits if your mom or your couldn't get benefits if there was a man in the house. So so at times systems have ran folks out of their neighborhoods and their communities, and have been a part, in my opinion, of breaking up families. Now, saying that, I would say now that I know those things, then how can I make sure that when I talk about that word legacy, now how can I change my legacy knowing that that's what I'm up against? And so I would talk to that person about, hey, finding some internal strength, right? And also validate what he's up against, but also say that, hey, if you have a child, if you have a son, you have a daughter, you want to make sure that you're passing on enough information, enough insight that they don't fall into the same thing. And so I think part of it is sharing the knowledge of the reality, but then also actively getting busy. And I would say to that non-resident father that his whole job would still be figuring out how to stay engaged with his children, because, again, that still is his role. And part of being engaged in his children is providing them cover to understand what he's been through and what they're going to go through, and why they perhaps to get a quality education so they can perhaps navigate the systems that he's articulating to them about how to navigate those systems a little better.
Okay, we have another question regarding non-custodial parents.
Okay.
So first of all, are there any initiatives or plans in place that you know of to support men who are non-custodial parents with visitation? And what would you suggest a male do to navigate that situation if you're dealing with custody issues with the mother?
Well, and I would say this, and I deal with this a lot, and I would say to fathers here, when you're dealing with it, you have to make the system work for you. Right? Now, not paying child support does not work. Now, believe it or not, I recommend many times, I asked a couple of questions. First of all, is your name on the birth certificate? All right? And if that's not there, then that's one of the first things you need to do is establish paternity. And then, I know a lot of fathers don't want to hear this, but around visitation, I tell them you must go and establish a child support case against yourself. Here in Texas, that's what I recommend, because then they have a little more control over the money that perhaps they're going to pay out also, and then also there's another system listening to their voice, and there's another system that's showing that this father is demonstrating that I am being proactive. You know, I'm not someone who don't want to be held accountable. I want to be held accountable, but also I want access to my children at the same time. And so I think too often what we do, we get frustrated. We go back to that word, we surrender, because what she does, she works our nerves a little bit, and we surrender. And what we're doing is we're surrendering on our children. And I think and I think that's when you should let the system start, letting the system work for you.
Okay, and our last question here, you're getting some kudos here. Outstanding program, presenter, and presentation. Is there a program model that we may have access to?
Well, I mean, one more time, Teddy, one more time.
Oh, you want to hear the compliments again?
No, the question.
Okay, is there a program model that we may have access to?
You know, I would say this, you know, there's all types of programs, and if anything, I would say there's the SAMHSA website have what we call evidence practice programs, and then you got guys like myself that I can travel the country also if someone wants me to come to their neighborhood, and I do a presentation called The Hole in the Soul, which is similar to this one to some degree. But I think SAMHSA is there, and then I think you know, you have to be conscious because you have a lot of these places that want to charge you for this stuff. And what I would do is go into if I'm in a city or in a county, I would go to my health and human services department initially to see what they have that at no cost before I start approaching folks like the National Fatherhood Initiative and fatherhood.gov, who has some programs. But yet those programs tend to cost you. But then also use this thing called the internet, you know, and just Google or Bing fatherhood evidence-based practices and see what you come up there. And then I think, Teddy, they may have, I don't know if you gave my number out, but feel free to give my work number out, right? And I think it should be on that presentation. But I am also available to come to communities and do presentations. And then also I would tell folks in the communities in your neighborhood, hey, you may want to start these things that we've been doing around Texas called Fatherhood Roundtables. And what we do with those roundtables, we bring folks from fathers from all walks of life, right, together, maybe at the max of maybe 25. But then also I have men from service providers there also. And then this begins starting having a conversation about men and their, you know, what opportunities, what challenges they have in their communities, what they have within their families, and then you'll be amazed of the men start to speak. And what happens in that environment, good folks, is that there starts to be this natural mentor role take place. Some of these men who are older, perhaps who didn't have fathers or maybe had sons, and their sons are gone, now become a mentor of one of these other young men who are struggling with identity. And so I think some of those things work well in both neighborhoods and communities.
Excellent. Kenneth, can you give everyone your information? I sent everyone your email address, but a number they can contact you.
Yeah, my work number, 512-438-4560.
One more time, please.
512-438-4560. You sound like you've been on a radio show, man, because every time you give out a number out on the radio, you want to give it out twice.
Yeah, I want to make sure that people can reach you. Definitely. Well, we have no more questions.
Okay.
Board,
well, I've enjoyed myself now.
Yeah, this was a very great webinar. Thank you for your time. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Archives of our webinars are always available on the Office of Minority Health YouTube channel. Just type in Preconception Peer Educators webinars and it should pop up. And Kenneth gave you his information, and if there are no further questions, we will close out the webinar. I'd also like to thank Dr. Gracia for her support on this webinar and the My Brother's Keeper initiative. You all can check that out on whitehouse.gov as well. Thank you all for joining us.
Hey, Teddy, did I tell? I did tell you that my son worked. Used to have done some work for the President of the United States of America.
Okay, you threw that in there so everyone knows that.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
want to give out his name?
No, no.
No, he doesn't get that much credit.
He's a junior. I gotta tell you that.
Okay, all right. Well, then they can figure it out. Thanks everyone for joining us, and it's been a pleasure.
All right, my friend. Thank you. I'll be in touch.
Thanks. Bye.